Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. Today, we're going to look at the rewards of worship. We see David was truly a worshiper. We saw that his wife, Michal, despised his demonstrative, passionate worship, and she had a barren, fruitless life. And we're going to see again those comparisons. I want to go to the New Testament, and I want to look at a passionate worshiper of Jesus, and that is Mary. Now, this is Mary, the sister of Lazarus, Mary and Martha. John chapter 12, verse 3, then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. She came to bring a valuable sacrifice to Jesus, and Jesus was blessed and honored by this sacrifice that she gave. This was actually a very large sum of money. This could be a dowry, and so she just poured it all out extravagantly on Jesus. And listen to the results. John 12, verse 3, and the house was filled with the fragrance of that oil. When we become extravagant in our worship, when we're extravagant in our giving, when we're extravagant in serving towards Jesus, what happens? His fragrance fills our home. The fragrance fills our home. Now, because she poured that oil upon Jesus and wiped her hair, using her hair to wipe Jesus' feet with it, when the whole house was filled with the fragrance, everybody benefited, everybody experienced the fragrance of that aroma. That's like coming to church, man. You're there and you felt nothing coming in, and then all of a sudden people are worshiping God, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I'm starting to feel God's presence, and whoo, this is good. You know, you actually just might be getting what's called a sloppy agape, meaning you're just experiencing God's presence, not because you're worshiping, but because other people are worshiping. And I go, you know what? Hey, secondhand God's presence is still great and still enjoyable, but here's what happens. When you go home, that fragrance doesn't go with you. But those who took the time to enter in, to touch Jesus with their worship, to touch Jesus with their giving, when they go home, that fragrance lingers with them, and sometimes it lingers for days and for weeks. So don't just watch worship, but you touch Jesus, because Jesus' fragrance and his presence goes back home with you, and it impacts your entire home. Now, when you do this, you can expect the same thing that Mary ran into, and it's this. You're going to get some critics. Mark chapter 14, verse 5, just a little bit of a different perspective on the same story. And they criticized her sharply, but Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. Know this, you will do good things for Jesus, and for whatever reason, somebody has the audacity to criticize you and tell you you're wrong and write some nasty little thing on the blog that you wrote trying to glorify Jesus, or they're going to criticize your tweet. They're going to say something nasty about the Bible study you led, or whatever. They're just out there. There will always be small people criticizing people that do great things for Jesus. But you know what? She didn't defend herself, but you know what Jesus did? There will come a day that Jesus will defend you, just like he defended Mary. Now, it might be this side of heaven that God vindicates you, and it might not be till we stand before the throne of God, but know this, heaven will right every wrong, answer every question, and it will solve every problem. God will vindicate you from those that are attacking you. You just trust him, and you know what? You just keep worshiping him. Keep your eye on him, and don't worry about the critics. Know this, there will also be a reward in heaven when we worship him, when we enter in and we make those sacrifices of praise. We make that sacrificial giving. We make the sacrifice of serving him with our time, our talent, and our treasure. And this is what Jesus says. And I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. Jesus will reward you for the sacrifice of every moment and every time that you're honoring him through the sacrifice of worship. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? And they criticized her sharply. There will always be people that criticize and call a waste of time what you do. And there are people who call worship a waste, giving a waste, serving a waste of time. And there's a story of, we've actually find out who one of these critics were. And you read over in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, we find that it was Judas that was the chief criticizer of Mary, saying, why this waste? This could have been used to help the poor. And then, there's a commentary footnote by John that says Judas was a thief. He didn't care about the poor. He was actually stealing from the Lord's money bag. And here's interesting wordage. The same word that Judas used to describe Mary's worship as waste, the word in the Greek is perdition. Well, we find that Jesus described Judas, who hung himself after he betrayed the Lord, because when we betray Jesus, we get all hung up. He used the word perdition to describe Judas's life. And the word perdition means waste. I find it interesting and not a coincidence that the one who called worship a waste of a life was the one that Jesus said was the one who actually wasted his life. You will never find it a waste of time, a waste of life, to give extravagantly to the Lord. When you're giving extravagantly of worship, when you're giving extravagantly in prayer, when you're giving extravagantly financially of your tithe, of your offerings, Jesus calls that a reward in heaven. He will defend you and he will richly reward you. But those who go, it's not worth it and it's a waste and I got better things I could do with my time, my talent, and my treasure, at the end of their life, Jesus ultimately says, unfortunately, you wasted the potential and the opportunities of what you could have had. Oh, there are people who are going to be in heaven. Oh, they're going to stand before God. Yes, they're saved. Yes, they made it. But there is that moment where Jesus wipes away every tear. And I genuinely believe it's before the reward seat of Christ, the Bema seat of Christ in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where we're rewarded for our works, whether good or bad, that there's going to be so many people that see what they could have had, what they could have been, the reward they could have had, but they thought it was a waste. And they're going to find out really they wasted an entire lifetime. They're in heaven, but their eternal impact and their internal weight of what they could do is diminished because they called worship a waste of time. Look forward to seeing you next week as we learn some more important lessons on the life of David.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.